The long night through Cinder Pass. The wind came down off the burned ridge like a saw across bone, dry and cold and full of old ash from summers that had forgotten mercy. Snow rode that wind in hard grains that stung the face and sang against tin. The first lantern winked once on the high ledge, and then went black under a glove as the watchman shielded it. Far below, the town pulled its shutters tight, and the bell rope was already tied so it would not speak, unless a hand begged it. On the north road, a wagon creaked, a mule coughed, and a woman in the back whispered to a round belly and said that the child had chosen a poor night to arrive. In the little room with bottles and cloth and a stove that clicked as it cooled, the healer set out a bundle of herbs, a needle kit, and a kettle that would not take its time tonight. Across the lane, the badge read a wire by lamplight, lips moving on words that were short and mean. Spotted fever had climbed the valley and was chewing on younger lungs first. The mine far side of Cinder Pass had the only chest of fresh vials, and that chest was now stuck behind 3 drifts in a gorge that had eaten a bridge last spring and never given it back. The wire did not care about weather or babies. It said, "Bring them by morning or count graves." The rider leaned a shoulder against the doorframe and stared at the white breath from the horse. Boots were dusted with frost, coat dark with melt. The shape in the eyes was the steady kind that gathers when a person has learned to walk storms without asking them for favors. The healer looked up and read the weight, and the weight looked back and read the calm. Between them passed a plan that did not need a name. Rope, sled, lanterns with shades, shovels, poles, enough hands to tie a net across the high country before the dark settled for good. The old tracker came last, thin as a fence slat, lines in the face deep as arroyos, smelling of smoke and pine pitch. He shook the snow from his hat and rolled out a map no one had drawn, a map that lived in scars and memory. He tapped the places where the wind scours the slope to ice and where cornices lie like sleeping beasts. He marked the spot where a fallen pine makes a bridge if you crawl true, and the place where the granite sings before it breaks. He talked of lee sides, of drift tongues, of how to walk so the mountain forgets to notice a body passing. The room nodded and did not pretend to be brave. Bravery talks. Need moves. They loaded the sled in the alley behind the clinic. The chest went in first, strapped tight, wrapped in quilts that had lived over beds for years and now would fight cold for the whole town. Next went a roll of canvas and stakes, a coil of rope greased just enough to stay flexible, and a basket of bandages that might catch a life or two if the mountain took a bite. The healer climbed up, wrapped a scarf over a mouth that had spoken calm words all day, and set a hand on the belly of the woman whose jaw was set against pain. The rider took the lead rope, the badge the rear, the stable boy set out with a pole, and the tracker stepped where he always stepped, into the place between danger and the rest. Snow began as a whisper in the street and became a hiss as they passed the last fence. The little procession ducked its heads and pushed into a dark that moved even when eyes stayed still. Lanterns went low and narrow, shades cutting glare so the light would not blind more than it helped. Over the first rise, the town fell away, and the land rose like a shoulder. Wind ran into their chests and pushed their words back into their mouths. Boots squeaked, leather creaked, rope sang. The mountains did not say anything. Mountains are not talkers. They hit the first drift at the bend where brush usually thins and found it piled deep and hard like a wall. The rider tested it with a boot, then a pole, then a hand. The hand came back cold and wet. The tracker cut steps up the face with the flat of a shovel, small and sure, each placed so the next foot knew where to land without thinking. The sled crawled behind, inch by inch, the mule leaning into the harness. The healer kept the woman warm with words about bread and July sun, and the way the creek feels around ankles in the first week of spring. Between the words, the healer counted the spacing between breaths, and looked at the pale skin around the eyes, and measured how much time the mountain had left them. At the low saddle before the ledge, the wind backed off and the snow fell straight down like quiet. That is the place where people get careless and where mountains wait for carelessness, like a snake under winter grass. The rider stopped the line with a hand. Above the saddle, A slope of smooth white lay so pure it hurt the eyes. Along the top edge, a lip hung a little, and from that lip a faint sigh came now and then, like the mountain had a throat and was swallowing. The tracker bent and put his ear to the snow. After a breath, he pulled his head up slow, eyes narrow, and spoke a single word that needed no telling twice. Spread. They made a chain wide, each a pole length from the next, ropes slack between them to keep one slide from taking the lot. The badge went far right along scrub where bushes poked dark fingers through white. The stable boy went left along a line of rock teeth. The rider kept the center by the mule and the sled. The tracker went one step ahead and to the side, feeling with the shovel, listening for the hollow sound under crust that means grave. The healer breathed with the woman and timed the waves of pain against the lift and fall of the wind. The mountain held its voice, but the lip trembled as if it were learning a new way to fall. They crossed slow. One step, test, listen. Another step, test, listen. The path they cut would be gone under the next hour of snow, but it was enough for now. At the far edge, the land turned to stone, and stone is honest in winter, even when it wants to kill you. The line drew in again, ropes snug. The healer let one hand rest on the sled chest and felt the cold through quilts that had heard lullabies and arguments and now hummed a new song. The woman clutched the healer wrist once, twice, 3 times, and the healer nodded without using words and set a panicked image in the mind aside like a tool put back where it belongs. Not yet. Hold. Beyond the saddle, the trail narrowed to a ledge the width of a door sill pinned to the side of a black wall. Below, the trees looked like spilled needles, and the creek cut a gray thread through the white. The wind blew sideways here and had the taste of old fire in it. Charred stumps stood on the far slope like teeth in a jaw. The rider ran a rope line along the inner posts, tied quick knots at hip height, and clipped the sled line through rings so a slip would only scare and not end. The mule flattened ears, puffed steam, and walked like a saint that has learned patience in a bad neighborhood. Halfway along, Trouble walked out of the storm wearing a hat and a hunger. A shape shook snow from a coat, then another, then 6 more, filling the trail from wall to drop. Lantern light found rough cloth and slung irons and smiles that had no shine. Voices came low and confident, riders by the sound even though no hooves clacked here. They had stepped off animals at the far notch and walked the ledge to find them like traders at a fair. The first voice said, the path cost coin now, and that the tax was what weight the sled carried. The second voice said that a baby was not a tax, but it made a fine reason to move quick and do as they were told. The rider did not move. The tracker did not move. The badge flicked snow off a brim and set one boot a 1/4 inch wider on the ledge. The healer did not look up, because looking up can give a bully the very thing he came for. The woman made a sound like a knife pulled from leather. The wind took it and cut it smaller, and gave it back to the mountains to keep. The first voice grew a grin that could be heard. The leader stepped close enough to see the shape of faces, and close enough to mistake stillness for fear. The rider spoke first. Not long, not loud, just enough to lay a line in the air where the ledge had left none. The words said that this trail did not belong to men who needed taxes to stand tall. The words said that if the leader took one step closer, the gift under the snow line would wake and take every body on this slope without counting. The leader laughed and took a small step, the kind a man takes when he needs to show his own to have courage. The tracker had already slid the shovel under the crust behind him. The badge tugged the far rope twice. The stable boy pulled the shade on the left lantern and let a round wash of light pour across the lip above. Light woke the mountain. A sound like paper tearing rose from the slope. The lip quivered, cracked, and then ran. Snow peeled away in a long white sheet and flowed down, slow as honey for a blink, and then as fast as a hand knows how to slap. It rushed over shattered stumps and boulders and screamed where it found a cut, and the whole face moved like a muscle flexed and let go. The leader grabbed air that had no grip and threw himself back into the wall. His crew did the same. The rider did not move. The line did not move. The healer pressed the woman's belly and counted. The slide tore down the far face and missed the ledge by the width of a ribbon. It roared past, threw spray of powder up into their teeth and was gone, leaving a wound of rock shaped like a mouth that had learned silence the hard way. Nobody laughed. A man coughed and spit and did not say what he had been about to say. The leader swallowed and found that his throat did not have the words he wanted anymore. The badge said that there would be work at the foot of the slope come morning, and that if a man had good boots and a back, he could earn coin honest pushing snow into a new creek. The healer said that if those men kept us from moving one more breath, the baby would arrive here on a ledge instead of by a stove, and that would be their memory all winter and more. The leader stepped back. The path opened. Boots shuffled. The ledge remembered it had room. They crossed the gorge at the fallen pine, crawling on bellies, faces in bark, snow caked in eyebrows and lashes. The mule snorted and lay and rolled once to shift the harness like a beast that trusts the rope more than it trusts thinking. The sled slid after, tied by 3 lines and guided by hands that did not shake because shaking hands do not get to hold ropes near cliffs. The canyon sighed. The wind twisted under the fallen tree and tried to lift the straightest people off the only thing keeping them from a long quiet. The tracker went first and grinned like a skull at the far lip and said a line about the mountain having more patience for fools than for quitters. The last shelf before the summit was a bowl of hard white and broken rock where the world stopped pretending to be kind. There they set the canvas and stakes and made a low wall to hunker behind, while the woman rode waves a minute apart, and then half, then a quarter. The healer rolled sleeves and set water to steam and put a blanket on the mule rump to steal more heat from fur and breath. The rider cut a pocket in a drift and set the chest there, out of wind, and tucked quilts tight so cold would have to argue through 2 histories to get at the glass inside. The badge stood with back to the gust and arms spread and did not feel noble. He felt cold and glad to be cold for a reason. Between 2 cries the world shifted. The storm did not ease, but something in it moved aside for a heartbeat. In that beat the baby came, angry at air, furious at light, loud as a bell that had learned it did not need a rope to ring. The healer laughed once, a sound like a tin cup hit gently with a spoon, and set the tiny shape against the woman's chest. The wind took that sound and was less mean for a cough. The rider looked away because sometimes a good thing needs privacy to set its first root. The tracker sniffed and said it was the onions in his pocket. There was no room for long pause. The pass still stood above in black rock and white anger, and the mine on the far side waited with its chest of vials as if time were furniture that could be moved when you felt like it. They packed the camp in minutes that felt like seconds, lashed the sled again, tucked the baby tighter into a quilt that had felt many small nights, and now felt the smallest. The mule shook and pulled and went on. The rope line tightened and loosed in a rhythm that became a prayer. The world narrowed to 10 feet of visibility, and the weight in the waist belt and the sound of breath where breath mattered most. At the very top, the wind became a wall. It pushed sideways so hard that boots wanted to be birds. They could not let them. They dug heels into crust and used poles like extra stubborn legs. The rider shouted once, a raw sound to bring the line into a staggered step that made no rhythm the mountain could use to count them. The tracker hummed a nonsense tune that was not for comfort, but for keeping brain and feet married. The healer put a hand between baby and wind and held it there until that hand forgot what warm means, and remembered later. The far side fell away into spruce and the first hint of less hurt in the air. The lee eased the noise, and the snow shifted from flying to falling again. The trail into the trees was tight and full of bent branches that shook themselves like wet dogs as the party pushed through. In the first hollow, the wind dropped to a breath and the world took color again under the white. They slid down a long slope on boots, the sled checking them, the rope singing, faces stung and wet and alive. At the creek in the mine valley, the watchman ran out with a lantern high and eyes bigger than sense. He pointed and stammered, and then shut up and grabbed a rope and pulled like a man who has found the piece of his life he had looked for and not named. The chest went into the warmth of the office. The foreman swore softly at the state of the straps, then swore softly in a different way at the sight of the baby, then swore softly in a third way when he saw the healer hands shaking as feeling came back. He put the lot around a stove and poured bitter coffee and sweetened it with the sugar he says he never gives to anyone. The baby calmed, the woman slept crooked, the mule steamed, and the badge stood by the door and did not remove the weight from a shoulder blade, because leaving it puts it back on someone else. There was no victory speech. The vials went into a padded crate that fit the sled like it had always meant to hold it. The foreman brought out old snowshoes and tied 2 pairs to feet that did not need them yet but might. The tracker pocketed a slab of cold meat and a heel of bread, and did not say the thanks because he never has and never will. The rider rolled the neck and set shoulders and looked into the notch where their own tracks were already gone. The healer put the baby into the mother arms and tied a long strip of cloth so that new life would ride against the chest like a second heartbeat. The woman opened her eyes, met the rider gaze, and gave the smallest nod a human face can hold, which is a weight and a gift and a command all at once. Back they went, into a wind that had only waited to hit them again. The mountain does not adjust its temper because a town needs a thing. The line moved faster downhill, but not careless. At the fallen pine, the sled slewed once and kissed bark and threw powder up like ash. The badge laughed a single short bark that made the mule flick an ear and listen to the good in it. At the ledge, the place where men had stood an hour ago to tax fear was empty. Tracks blew in with a speed that would erase guilt if guilt were easier to relieve than it is. The slide face lay still, new muscle under old bone. They passed as if walking the teeth of a saw, and felt the curve of the world tighten under their boots. In the bowl, the canvas went up again for a scant minute to let the woman drink, and for the healer to check color and heat. The baby slept and woke and complained and slept again because new life has no respect for weather or story. The tracker listened to the wind and said it was lying less than before. The rider believed him without asking for proof. Belief is not the same as foolishness when it is built from long years trekking the same wounds in the earth. At the saddle, the lip had fallen where it would not again tonight. They crossed with more space in the chests, but the same careful feet. Over the first rise, the town glow was a smear under the storm, the kind that cooks hope out of cold and gives it smell. Lanterns bobbed on the road below, small, stuttering stars. The bell did not ring. It did not need to. Through the last drift, over the last ditch, down into the lane with shovel marks from earlier skirmishes with lesser winters, and into the square, where hands grabbed and pulled and guided and shouted soft instead of loud. The chest went into the clinic. The healer lined up the vials like soldiers who have finally been ordered into the fight. The badge took the list and checked names with a pencil that had been chewed to the size of a thumb. The tracker leaned in the door and refused to come any closer to the stove until someone said it out loud, even if everyone already knew to say it. Someone said it. Sit. He did. The rider stepped outside and leaned on the porch post and let the night move through and out, breath by breath, until the ground under boots felt like ground again, and not some idea the mountain had thrown together to make a point. By dawn, the storm had pulled its blanket up off the valley and left the world scoured and bright. The bell rope hung loose. A line of people stood outside the clinic waiting for the bitter sting of glass to be traded for the longer burn of life. The baby slept behind a thin curtain in a bassinet that had once been a drawer in a cabinet and was now a boat crossing the first little sea. The woman snored and did not care who heard. The foreman sent a runner with a sack of coal and a note that said the mine would eat the cost even if the ledger did not know how to add that kind of number. The runner did not understand and did not need to. The raiders who had tried to tax the ledge took shovels to the foot of the slide at first light, not because they had turned to saints in a night, but because the badge had a gift for pulling a decent thread out of a dirty coat, and because there was coin at the end of that thread, and because some of them had watched a baby being born in the sky and could not walk the same way they had walked the day before. Work made them quieter. Quiet made them different. Different makes better things possible if it does not break. At noon, the healer came out in the sun and blinked like an owl. The rider stood by the pump and let water cut grit from the face. The badge read 3 names out loud from the list of those who would live because a vial broke the fever. The tracker showed the stable boy how to read snow for truth, even when it pretends. The blacksmith set a kettle on a coal and made something that tasted like tea even if it was not. The town looked at the ridge and did not feel small for once. It felt the right size for its own skin. Toward evening, the sky went copper and the wind lost its teeth. The river whispered somewhere under new ice. The mule slept on 4 feet and dreamed with lips twitching. The baby made a sound like a bird. The healer set the tiny bundle into arms that had ached for it through the night and smiled in a way that had nothing to do with mountains or vials or ledges. The rider watched and then did the decent thing and looked away again. The badge cleared a throat and said the road crew on the far side had cleared all the way to the last bend, and the pass would hold if tended, and tending is what a place chooses every day or forgets how to live. There was a parcel on the fence by the clinic door, wrapped in cloth. Inside were coins, a strip of clean bandage, and a biscuit still warm. The badge said it was not pay. The badge said the town had decided to stop paying the wrong people. The rider nodded and left the parcel on the rail for a while so the last of the sun could make it glow, and so a tired eye could rest on it and see a shape it liked. The tracker grumbled and took half the biscuit because that is his way of agreeing when he cannot manage the words. Night fell soft. Lamps burned, not as signals this time but as home. The rope at the bell hung slack. The ledge up high lay quiet and silver. In the clinic the kettle hummed, and the room smelled of clean cloth and something sweet under it that might have been hope, or might have been the sugared tea the blacksmith had forced on everyone. People walked by the window and did not hurry for once. They had hurry inside enough for 10 winters now, and meant to spend it slower. Later the rider saddled the plain horse. The healer came to the door and stood with a cup in hand and did not say, "Do not go," or "Please stay," because those are sentences from a different season. There was a look across the small space that settled like a quilt at the end of a day. The rider touched the brim. The healer lifted the cup. The badge leaned on the rail and pretended to watch a nail in a post. The tracker snored on a bench like an insult to exhaustion. The road out of town was not a road so much as a memory of wheels and hoofs and small feet. It bent where rock asked it to bend, climbed where roots had stitched soil tight, and dropped where rains had carved. The rider followed it as far as the first rise, then turned in the saddle to see the square, the clinic, the white on roofs, the thin smoke rising straight. Somewhere under that smoke a new life had opened its eyes and yelled at the world, and the world had yelled back and then laughed a little and kept turning. The rider took that sight and tucked it into the place where warmth lives and does not brag. Then the horse stepped forward, and the night made room the way it always has when a person means to put their weight where it belongs. By morning the pass would drift again. Men would shovel. Women would call from doors. Children would learn the new whistles that mean all clear and the old ones that still mean get inside. The raiders would show up with sore backs and jokes not yet ready to be gentle, and the badge would point at a corner that needed bracing, and a ditch that needed cutting, and the tracker would point at the sky and say what it meant in a language no one else speaks, but everyone understands. The healer would pour a few more glass bites into waiting mouths and lie and say they taste fine, and the baby would ignore it all and sleep, then wake and demand everything. Cinder Pass would keep its name and get another under it, the way places do when people choose to remember. Some would call it White Fire, some the Long Night, some simply that ridge. The rider would ride north a while and then east, then south, following the way the land invites and the way trouble whispers when it wants to be met by someone who does not carry a book of speeches. And when the next hard weather came, the town would tie its nets, set its ropes, lower its lanterns and make their small knots again, because that is the way a place survives a horizon that never loved it much. They would count not graves but bowls on a table, not losses but hands, not storms but nights that turned as this one had into mornings that belonged to them.